Welcome into episode 374 of the Skate Podcast. I am Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin. Bridget and Scott, the Bruins' brief two-game win streak could not extend to a third consecutive win, a goal that they have failed to achieve at any point this season. They fall 2-0 to the Vancouver Canucks. It's the fourth time this season, but in particular in the last 17 games that the Bruins have been shut out. And with that in mind, we'll go right into our opening shifts, which is for me that up until this point in the season, the Bruins are dead last in the NHL in goals per game. I mentioned the last 17 games they've had four shutouts against them, and in that time they have a 1.76 goals per game average. On the season, the Bruins have a 2.22 goals per game average. And did I say goals against per game average a few minutes ago? I meant to say goals per game.
I think you said goals per game.
Yes. Sometimes I doubt myself. So anyway, just to reiterate, they've scored 1.76 goals per game in the last 17 games, shut out 4 times. They've scored 2.22 goals per game on the season. And I got that from Scott's wonderful article on weei.com. Now, Charlie McAvoy after the game mentioned that.
Did I write goals against per game?
No.
Okay.
No.
Blame Scott. When in doubt, blame Scott.
The 2.2 gols per game.
I mean, I do have a really bad editor, so.
Yeah, it's himself, by the way.
So Charlie McAvoy said after the game last night that the dam has to break at some point. Well, that's great. At some point is subjective, and if it's too late, then that does the Bruins no good. At the end of the day, yes, the Bruins have had some bad luck offensively. They have some guys underperforming. David Pastrnak in particular, if he alone is just David Pastrnak, this team should be much better offensively. The fact that he's on a pace for 40 less points than he normally gets, Pastrnak alone, this team should be better offensively. But at the end of the day, guys, you're not last in the league in scoring by accident or by some misfortune. Now, they have turned their 5-on-5 game around under Joe Sacco. Their defensive structure is better. Their shot generation has increased, but the lack of finish has been a problem all year, and it's going to continue to be a problem until they prove otherwise.
I tend to agree with Charlie McAvoy, though, that the dam is going to break at some point. Like, my eyes are telling me that the bounces that they're getting right now are just so often going the other way. And my opening shift it's kind of, a joke, but at the same time, sometimes I'm watching the play, especially last night, and I'm going, are we living in an alternate universe where the puck's not allowed to go in the net? Like, where it's just bouncing every which way but into the goal, or a guy's stick is on the ice and the puck bounces over it and it would be shot into an open net. And like, I swear Pastrnak had a sequence last night against Vancouver where I have no idea how it doesn't end up in the back of the net. Like, the puck is just bouncing around the crease, multiple shots at it. There was another time where Brazeau was in a similar situation. There was a time where Marchand was backdoor and the puck just bounced away from him, but he would have had a wide open net to shoot into. And it's like, really, sometimes the bounce gets you. And that's why puck luck isn't just like a joke. Like, it's a real thing. Like, it bounces. And because the puck is the way it is, it's very random. So yeah, I mean, I feel like if you watched yesterday's game and the Bruins are out shooting Vancouver right along the whole game, they end up out shooting them 32-15. And the middle frame, they outshot them 13-6. Like, the Bruins were getting chances. They were getting quality chances. And like you guys said, there's no finish. But a lot of times it has to do with the way that just the puck is bounced. And so, like, yes, I think that they're probably, and Scott, maybe you have the advanced stats to this, like, how many expected goals did they have yesterday? Because it felt like it should have been not 0. And they've come so close. And the same thing applies to, like, some of the challenges that they've lost. Like, it's by a smidge and or maybe not the right call. But But yeah, I do think the dam's going to break at some point.
Yeah, 3.44 expected goals for the Bruins last night. Yeah,
it's like a force field. It's just like, nope.
So I would agree that last night was a game that they actually generated a lot of chances and a lot of quality chances. 18 high danger chances, and only gave up 2. And ran into a combination of bad luck, hot goaltending, lack of finishing. They did have some great looks that they didn't take advantage of. Like Pavel Zacha in particular had 2 just point blank golden opportunities where he hit Kevin Lankin in the chest. And it's like, you got to make it harder than that.
And Scott did exclaim that from the 9th floor. Like, he just shot it into his chest. Like, Scott was all frustrated, like, that he didn't pick a corner.
Yeah. And, but I will say that's one game of doing that. That's one game of the dam not breaking, because I did not think that was the case in the previous 2 games. Sacco's first 2 games as interim head coach, the defense was there, but I didn't think they really were creating a ton of chances either. So this was something a little different. And my opening shift is about a player who could potentially help when it comes to not scoring, and that is Chris Kreider of the New York Rangers, who is, according to multiple reports, on the trade market, is available. The Rangers have had their own struggles of late. They've lost 3 in a row. General manager Chris Drury apparently sent out a memo to the other 31 GMs saying, we're open for business. I want to shake things up, and specifically mentioned 2 veterans, Chris Kreider and Jacob Trouba, as players who he would be willing to trade. And, for the Bruins purposes, Kreider is the more appealing one because he is the forward and he is a goal scorer. 35 or more goals in each of the last 3 seasons. Has had a slow start in terms of his all-around game this year, and yet still has 9 goals in 19 games, which would lead the Bruins. Still finishing like he usually does. So I think there's a lot to get into there. There's a lot of potential hang-ups and maybe even reasons not to do it. But I definitely think it's a player that the Bruins should be looking at, because this is the kind of trade that they should be looking for. Like, it would be a pretty significant shakeup, and it could be a player who addresses their biggest need right now, which is someone who can put the puck in the net and finish chances.
That would be devastating for Rangers fans. That, like, Kreider is so well liked there. And also, what would you have to give up? Because that's not a small move. I mean, I know he's 33, but that's a big, like, that would require giving up a lot.
Yeah, so first off, the salary has to match. So Kreider has a $6.5 million cap hit. Bruins have less than $1 million in cap space, so it has to be more or less equal. And you're right, the Rangers would have to get an impact player in return because they are still in win now mode. I think they might want like a top pick or prospect as well, but more likely, like, if they're trading Kreider, they're trying to replace him, use that money elsewhere. Like, they're not just going to be $6.5 million under the cap. Where the Rangers could use help is on defense. Their team defense has not been good this season. It's been their biggest problem. So you wonder about like a position for position hockey trade. Could the Bruins deal a defenseman? And you look at, you look at Hampus Lindholm, Nikita Zadorov, Brandon Carlo. Carlo, you would have to combine with someone. He's at $4.1 million. So, I wonder, like, Carlo and Trent Frederick, like, does that get it? Or the other one would be Hampus Lindholm straight up. That is 2 $6.5 million players. Obviously, Lindholm's a little younger and signed longer term. He signed through 2030. But he's also injured right now. And according to our own Rich Keefe's reporting, which I have no reason to question, is expected to miss another month. So I don't know if the Rangers would have any interest in trading for a guy who's going to be out a month. Like, they would probably want to wait until he's back and to make sure he's healthy. So I think that's like where you would have to look. I think people want to do the like, oh, let's try to combine all our underachieving forwards. I don't think that really does anything. I don't know why the Rangers would do that. The reason they're potentially moving Kreider is because they've had a bunch of young forwards step up. Like, they actually kind of have like a glut of wingers right now. So my guess is they would be looking towards your blue line.
And obviously this doesn't match up salary cap wise, but like if it were more of a rebuilding team like Mason Laura, I feel like would be the obvious one for them to look at. But like maybe they like him, but the salary is still the issue. Like I doubt they're going to be retaining salary for Kreider's, like a majority of Kreider's contract for that trade to work.
Let me ask you guys a question. Two-part question. Number one, if the trade were Brandon Carlo and Trent Frederick for Chris Kreider, would you do it? And part two, would the Rangers do that?
Well, personally, the Bruins' defensive depth right now isn't great, I don't think. Like, we thought that it was very good, but, like, losing Brendan Carlo feels like it would be kind of a significant, and that's the point. Like, it's obviously a significant loss for both teams. Kreider would be a big loss for the Rangers too. So, that's what's going to have to happen. But do you really think the Bruins' defensive depth is good enough? Like the next guy up with Lindholm out is Osterley or like Sweezy or someone, like if you call up someone else, and I guess Ian Mitchell. But I don't know if the Bruins can really risk the defensive side of their game. It's kind of what the team was supposed to be built around.
So I would do it. I would make that trade if I'm the Bruins. And yes, you would be especially thin until Hampus Lindholm comes back. So you would, you'd be scraping by for this next month. So if you did the trade today, I mean, maybe it doesn't happen for 2 weeks, and then, it's a little less time that you're rolling out a depleted D unit. But yeah, it wouldn't be ideal because that means you're probably bumping either Andrew Peeke or Parker Wotherspoon up to a top 4 role on that right side. You would definitely be much thinner on your right side. Or, maybe you try moving Mason Lohrei over there or something like that. But so yeah, like it creates another question mark. But to me, that would be a smaller question mark than the one you have up front right now in your top 6. And I just think this is a team that needs, you have to try something. And is that a perfect slam dunk trade? No, it's not. But I don't think that trade is going to be out there. So for what this Bruins team needs, that's a risk I would be willing to take. I ultimately would say yes to that.
To this point in the season,
I don't mind it. I just see the potential like danger of the Bruins are not in a playoff spot right now. So you don't like it's a big risk to take someone out of your defense. And like you said, maybe this happens closer to when Lindholm comes back. That makes it a little bit less risk averse, but you also don't get the scoring from Chris Kreider potentially over that 2-week span. So in the whole adding Kreider to try to just infuse life into the offense, obviously he's a leader. That is also something we feel like they've been lacking this year, is maybe another voice in the room to motivate, to energize. So that could benefit them as well. And that's kind of one of those intangibles that maybe the organization realizes is such a big need that outweighs the risk of losing a defenseman. And Brian, your opening shift was that the Bruins are scoring, the fewest goals per game in the league right now in the last 17 games. Well, maybe this trade would fix that part of it. And you just hope that you're not now giving up more goals to kind of balance it right out and kind of make it a net 0.
Yeah. Well, I think Chris Kreider would help that immensely because, first of all, he can move. He skates on the inside of the ice, and he doesn't care how he scores goals. He just cares that they go in, and that's something that the Bruins need. And he's also a power play specialist in front of the net, which is something the Bruins also need. As far as what the Bruins would be giving up, I would do this trade yesterday. Now, I was higher on Trent Frederick until this season started, like he was trending upwards. But if this is what we're going to get out of Trent Frederick in a contract year, then I'm not signing him next year going forward anyway, because unless it's for pennies on the dollar, because he, to me, right now is one of the biggest disappointments on the Bruins, in my opinion. His combination of size, and he does have some skill, and toughness just hasn't been on display. And so if the Rangers view Trent Frederick as somebody that they can, you know, get under his current contract and then extend him or whatever at the end of the year or mid whatever, and they think that he could be a reclamation project, great. As far as Brandon Carlo goes, look, I like Carlo. I think he's a good guy in the room, and he's been around for a long time. I think he's very important on the penalty kill, and I think generally speaking, he's important to the Bruins 5-on-5 defense. However, there's a lot more to playing defense than just being able to utilize your long strides and your long stick to keep defenders to the outside. Brandon Carlo is a non-factor in the Bruins transition game from the back end. He doesn't skate the puck well. He does not have great hands, and he does not make that first pass very effectively, if rarely ever. And he's certainly not an effective player on the opposite side of the red line where the Bruins are trying to play offense. So to me, I'm glad he's a big body that can keep players to the outside when he's on his game. And when he's on his game, I definitely see his impact, and I understand what he brings to the table. To me, it does not outweigh the negatives that he doesn't bring to the table on a consistent basis. And oh, by the way, how effective has he been this year at being that stay-at-home shutdown defenseman? Because in my opinion, this entire Bruins roster, up until recently under the coaching change, has had a lot to yearn for defensively, and he's included in that. So you have to give to get. I'm not saying you wouldn't be losing something with Brandon Carlo. However, I'm not interested in trading away high draft picks or first round draft picks or any of their higher prospects like a Mason Lohrei or a Matt Patra. So if you can tell me that you can get Trent Frederick, or you can get Chris Kreider for Trent Frederick on an expiring contract, and he has 6 points through 20 plus games this year and has been very invisible. And for Brandon Carlo, who in my opinion, he's not a young kid anymore. He's probably on the second half of his career and doesn't bring a total package of defense to me, because believe it or not, transitional defense and offensive defense is part of playing defense as well. You have to get the forwards to puck. So I would do it yesterday. I don't know if the Rangers would do it, but if they would, then I would do it.
I guess that's the real question. Like, how much would they value? I think they would value Brandon Carlo. I don't know how much they would think Trent Frederick adds to this.
They would value Carlo for what Scott said. They're struggling so heavily on the 5-on-5 defense. So there's the positional strength for strength, and
But if they have like a abundance of wingers, I mean, Frederick can play center as well. And the thing is, like, a lot of times teams want to add toughness, and Frederick is an answer to that too when he's playing a certain way, but we just haven't seen it this year. So it's like, if he can go back, and they believe that he can go back to how he's handled himself in the past, being a little bit of a pest, sparking energy with some conflicts, like how Kastelik has been doing it this season. Like, Frederick had that in him in seasons past. If he can get back to that, then I see the value there for him. But this season, it's hard. It's harder to make the case that they would want to make that move because the value is different.
Yeah, I mean, but it seems like he does still have some interest or value around the league. Like we saw that report from Kevin Weeks, which just kind of came out of the blue, and certainly seems like probably a plant by his agent. But like, if that's the word out there, you get it. Like, you get what teams see in Trent Frederick and why he would be an appealing player to them. And I think a lot of GMs and a lot of teams can talk themselves into, well, a change of scenery will spark them. And it might, by the way. Like, again, Trent Frederick can be a 20-goal scorer in this league. We've seen him have that kind of potential. So I can easily see why another team would think like, well, we'll bring him in here and we'll get that. Like, he can be that for us. And I think the Rangers, like, especially if they're trading away Kreider, that kind of, power forward type of player, like, I think would fit. Like, I think that would be something that, they'd want to mix in. So, yeah, I don't know if it'd be enough, but like, I could see why that package, and like maybe you have to throw in like a mid-round pick or something with it. Like, I could see why that could appeal to them.
Well, and they would also be making that trade, and I'm talking about the Rangers. And if they don't think that, they're getting enough offense back in return, their mindset is probably, this is a shakeup that we want. Carlo's going to help shore up our defense a little bit, 5-on-5 and on the PK, hopefully. They'll find out quickly he's not going to help their transitional game, but that's not what they're looking for, because they have Adam Fox and they have other guys, Keandre Miller, that can move the puck. And then with Trent Frederick, you'll absolutely see a bounce back from Trent Frederick, because that's just what happens in the NHL when a player gets to change the scenery. And then the Rangers would say to themselves, okay, now what are we looking at come February, March? What top 6 forward can we probably add at the deadline to try to mitigate maybe the loss that we're still feeling from Kreider's offense? Now, with Trent Frederick, there's something off there. And Don Sweeney made a comment a couple weeks back, or not even, when they fired Monty, saying that, we need to identify, if there's anybody out there does want to be a Bruin, and, and make some changes. And, Trent Frederick, I'm not saying he's one of those guys, but to me,
I don't think he is. I don't think he's one of those guys.
we honestly, none of us can really say for sure.
Well, I mean, based on his own comments,
be.
Every single time we've ever talked to him, like, he seems like completely content with being here. And I think he's bros with like Coyle, and I don't think he actually wants to go anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean,
Bridget, what's anybody going to say though? No one's going to say that.
Right, that's what I feel like. What player have you ever heard say, "I don't want to be here"?
Okay, but like when he says it, like, I don't feel any spin to it, if you know what I mean. Like, it genuinely feels like he means it.
I'm not trying to spark a headline here. All I'm saying is, what I look for is how players are playing. I learn a lot more from their play on the ice and what they say to the media. And I'm not saying Trent Frederick's one of these players. I'm just, look, Don Sweeney said the comment, not me. So, when he says that comment, my ears perk up. Okay, somebody in that room, potentially one or more people, might not be happy with their situation for one reason or the other. And I can't definitively say it's not anybody in that room, because we don't know. So Trent Frederick, to me, looks like a player who was trying to get out some frustration against the Florida Panthers in the beginning half of this, in the first couple weeks of the season, based off of last year. He wasn't able to scratch that itch, and he seems to be a player that just hasn't been able to get on a track this year. And he just seems like a player who wanted some revenge, didn't get it, and now he's just kind of coasting through a regular season. And Joe Sacco was asked about what Charlie Coyle and Trent Frederick need to do to get going this year. And Joe Sacco said they need to start moving their feet. When they're moving their feet, they're on time to plays, they're physically engaged, and they impact the game. He said that before last night's game. Charlie Coyle and Trent Frederick last night, to me, were some of the only Bruins players that kind of appeared to be passengers out there for the most part. And again, I'm not saying it's conscious, and I'm not saying it's intentional, but I saw a Bruins team out there last night that for the most part was snake bitten, and that they were generating. And I didn't find that those two players were. There was one play in particular, Charlie Coyle got out-muscled by Connor Garland, and Trent Frederick was going through the motions. So if Trent Frederick is a player that's not happy with his current situation, and the Bruins know that, or whatever, and he has value to the Rangers, it's something that has to be considered. I'm not trying to say Trent Frederick doesn't love being in Boston, doesn't love his teammates, but it's just until we had everything's on the table at this point.
And there's one last thing I want to say about this trade that makes it even more risky, is the fact that the Bruins and the Rangers are in a battle for the same wild card spots right now. Like, the Rangers are in the top wild card spot. They're 2 points ahead of the Bruins. when you trade guys that you know, within the conference, and this is a risk for both sides. When you trade guys within the conference, they can come back to bite you. Like that trade can very easily come back and be the reason why one of these teams makes the playoffs and one doesn't, because they're competing for the same spot right now. If these are just wild card teams and they're not going to be able to pop up into the top 3 in their divisions, like this is a competition that you if you're the Rangers and you trade Kreider to Boston and then he scores on you and then all of a sudden he starts adding this offense and the Bruins start taking off, that hurts your chances of making the playoffs.
Yeah, but I don't really think you can worry about that though. Like you just have to make the best trade for your team. And if you're the Bruins and you decide that you're willing to give that up to get Kreider because you believe he's the player who can help elevate your offense, then you do it. And like you don't get hung up on where he's going. Like, you know, okay, so like you can say like, all right, well, you know what, we're not going to do that. We'd rather hold out for, you know, a trade with the Western Conference team. And it's like, well, that might never come along. And if you're the Rangers and you want to try to shore up your defense, like, okay, you can say, well, we don't want to send Kreider to Boston. What if no option better than Brandon Carlo becomes available to you? Like, so you just have to do what's best. And if that means sending a guy in conference, then so be it. Like, I think in all sports, like GMs should be more willing to make deals within conferences and divisions. Like, that's never really, like, I get it. Obviously, I understand the hesitation, but I've always thought like you just make the best deal, period. And if it's in a conference or division or a traditional rival or whatever, like, so what?
Okay, so we have some mailbag questions to get to. I don't know if we plugged that off the top, but we'll get to those before we do. Before we do, just one last comment for me on the game last night against the Canucks. Back-to-back strong performances from Jeremy Swayman. I know the Canucks didn't test him all too much, but can't fault him on that goal. Which, by the way, if we haven't mentioned it, Jake DeBrusk comes back to haunt the Bruins in the automatic former Bruins scoring against the Bruins in probably a game-winning fashion as well, which is a tale's oldest time.
When they announced the goal, it got booed.
Well, that makes sense. I can't imagine they would cheer.
Well, no, but like that normally doesn't happen. Usually they just announce it and it's like quiet. And no, this was like this was a different reaction. Like this was a going out of your way to boo it because it doesn't. Normally they just announce it and everyone's just like, meh, you know.
Well, yeah. it was also sneaky clever by the Bruins to combine DeBrusk and Heinen in the video during the first TV timeout. Because, like, I think if it was just DeBrusk, my feeling is it would have been mostly cheers, but you would have heard some boos. But you throw in Heinen, and it's like, well, no one's going to boo Danton Heinen. So then it just ends up being mostly cheers. Like, not the most enthusiastic in the world, but no real booing during that part.
Yeah, it was. There's certainly been guys that came back that got louder cheers, but
Linus
yeah,
Ullmark just a couple weeks ago.
Linus Ullmark got a big cheer.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I'm sure the Bruins weren't itching to give Jake his own tribute video either, considering some of the drama that went on about not wanting to be in Boston.
I thought we were all over that though. I feel like
no, yeah, we are, but clearly Cam and Don hold some grudges. I mean. You know, they had to go out spitting chiclets when they heard one bad thing about themselves. So I don't know. They could be petty up there.
What did he call them?
Spin up on yourselves podcast.
Yeah, spin up on yourself.
Clearly, Cam and Don listen to, you know, they have, you know, they could be spitfires over there, whether you like it or not.
The one thing I did want to say about Swayman before we get to the mailbag is that he had a comment in the scrum last night about we had our own me and Bob had our own little mini camp, our training camp. Basically, like, what it made me think of is like, okay, well, that could have drawn a little bit of negative, which I didn't see online actually, but I thought that maybe some fans would negatively react to that because, like, okay, well, you chose to miss training camp, but you're doing like a mini training camp and it's helping. It's like, okay, well, where would your game have been if you went to the real training camp? Was kind of one of the things I thought I would see online. But I think people are just happy that he's playing better. So whatever it takes, I guess, to try to get yourself mentally back where you need to be or physically back where you need to be. But I think it's more of a mental thing.
Yeah. I mean, he also just like straight up is not getting tested because the one good thing the Bruins have going for him is they have locked down defensively, especially 5-on-5. Swayman's last 2 starts, he faced one high danger chance on Tuesday and 2 the previous game. So, they're just not giving anything up, and the Bruins' 3 best games in terms of expected goals against have been the last 3 since Sacco took over. So that's a positive. Now, obviously, you have to add the offense on top of it, but but maybe it takes a game like that, like a couple games like this, to get Swayman's confidence back because ultimately, regardless of how the game looked, if you look up on the scoreboard and see 1 goal against, you feel pretty good about yourself.
All right, guys, we get to jump into some questions here.
Sure.
All right. So first up is an email from Mark. He says, since I know nothing about Sacco other than how he runs the PK, I'm trying to find out your thoughts as to how he will handle the roster and lines in terms of the younger players on the team. Will he give them an opportunity to shine and see what he's got as he builds the lines, or will the leash be short and the roster continue to be constructed by Sweeney in terms of who he has to work with? Goes on to, give some examples, Patra, Lysell, Lorai. Will Sacco allow players, like you said, to make mistakes and grow? But that's generally the gist of his question. For those out there unfamiliar with Sacco, may know he's been around for about 10 years with the Bruins, may know he coached in the NHL as a head coach before with Colorado, may know he runs the PK in Boston. What else should we know about Joe Sacco? And we have seen 3 games with him as a head coach at this point, but I think these questions are still kind of unanswered.
Yeah, so the first thing there is Don Sweeney always has final call on roster decisions. In terms of, and what I mean by that is in terms of who's up, who's down between Boston and Providence. The head coach can have input and does and can give his opinion, but ultimately that is for Sweeney to decide in the end. As far as how he handles, say like young players making mistakes or working through them, I think we're going to find out. Like, I don't know if we've really seen that yet. Again, they have had 5-on-5 structure here recently. But yeah, what happens, when you get that game where Mason Lorai struggles defensively or makes a couple mistakes, or Johnny Beecher's effort wanes a little and he's not on top of his game? Because like those are 2 examples that come to mind. Obviously, Patra would be another one. Once he gets back here, we did see Georgi Merklev had 1 game under Sacco, I think. Then it went Tyler Johnson, Mark McLaughlin. So I think we're still finding that out. Like when he was head coach in Colorado, he had to be patient with young players because that was a rebuilding team. Like that was, almost like a ground up rebuild, and it was like a lot of young players. So that was a situation where you had to be patient. Where the Bruins are right now, like they still believe they're a playoff team. So they're in a fight. Like everyone always circles Thanksgiving on the calendar because anywhere like usually 75 to 80% of the playoff field is set at Thanksgiving, just historically, statistically speaking. And right now the Bruins are not in a playoff spot, so they're fighting. And as long as you are fighting, as long as you believe you have a shot at the playoffs, you can't be too lenient with young guys making mistakes. Like I think that almost necessitates having a fairly short leash, because this team can't afford a lot of mistakes, and they can't afford to just, allow a game to slip away because, well, all right, this young guy is kind of struggling, but I'm going to play him in the 3rd period anyways to see how he handles it. Like, no, like Joe Sacco kind of has to coach every game to win, period, whatever that looks like or takes. Now, If we get a couple months from now and they're not a playoff team, then maybe that changes. And maybe at that point you have to start playing young players and let them work through it and your goals shift. But for now, I think you're going to see more short leashes than long.
Yeah, I feel like that's always kind of been the Bruins too. Like I feel like a lot of times they're very quick to send someone to develop in Providence and they trust that version of development where they don't necessarily, because they've been a playoff team too, like this is why it's been handled like this. They don't take the risk of letting people make mistakes and figure out at this level. So it's been pretty common for that to happen. And like Scott said, Sweeney is the guy who ultimately decides about the ups and the downs. Now, if Sacco comes to him and says, I think Poitras would help in this situation and he can make his argument, then maybe they collaborate to come to the agreement that he comes back up. So that's still a possibility. But at the end of the day, like it's only a suggestion when it comes from Sacco. It's Sweeney that makes the call up or send down.
Yeah, and another factor here too is Joe Sacco is coaching under an interim title at the moment, and which means that he is, he's looking at this opportunity, Monty being fired as a second chance to be a head coach in the National Hockey League, and how long his second chance continues in Boston is probably highly dependent on if they make the playoffs this year. So to points that Bridget and Scott made, yeah, like he's gonna try to mitigate rookie mistakes that cost his teams games. Now, here's the problem. Yes, historically, the Bruins have always been a playoff team, but they've also never struggled like this offensively where their NHL guys aren't performing to their standards. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place where sticking with you either bring up kids and make yourself vulnerable to rookie mistakes and potentially losing points in the standings because you're going to let them grow. So that's a risk. But what's also a risk to not making the playoffs is to have these NHL veterans continue to underperform and pretty much no show in many offensive categories this year. And that's not going to get into the playoffs either. So it might be enticing to try to jumpstart the offense. And so it's not as simple as it has been in the past for Bruins coaches weighing, missing the playoffs or making the playoffs as a indicator of their job security, because he doesn't have the luxury of NHL players performing to their standards. I mean, like we've talked about, the Bruins are dead last in the NHL in goals per game right now. If David Pastrnak is just David Pastrnak, that's not the case, right? So David Pastrnak alone, the Bruins offense should be better. Now, is Charlie Coyle a 60-point guy like he was last year? No, clearly not. However, he's been a historical 35-point guy, 40-point guy. And right now he's on pace for like 15 points. So forget his 60-point career year. He's not even close to what he normally does. Can you sit there and say, well, he's 32, that's why? Maybe. But how much difference does 6 months make? Pavel Zacha, he's in what's considered his prime. He has had 55-plus point seasons in Boston the last 2 years. He's on pace for even less than what he did in New Jersey. So there's a lot of underperformances that doesn't allow them to be there where they are, let alone the Morgan Geekies and Trent Fredericks. So it's a rock and a hard place, but I do think Sacco will probably lean towards the NHL guys because they've shown that they can do it.
Yeah,
whether or not they do, that's a different story.
Yeah, and like obviously right now, as we've talked about, they're trying to build this from the back out, right? Like Sacco's task number one was reestablish our defensive identity and structure. We're seeing them do that. So it's easier to do that with guys who have played in that structure, who have been around the league, who understand what you're trying to do. And now the next step is building out from there and adding the offense. And like maybe that's where, at some point you say, okay, this is where bringing Poitras back makes sense. Or maybe it's another chance for Merkulov, or maybe Fabian Lysell finally gets a shot. Although, by the way, like none of them are really scoring all that many goals down in Providence. You'd like to see a little bit more from them.
Well,
but
Patra
that's
has no goals. We looked this up before we started. He's got 3 assists in 5 games. That's what he's done.
yeah. So like maybe once you feel comfortable about your defense, your structure, all that, then maybe you can take a few more chances and start to add stuff in. But while we're here, I wanted to maybe skip ahead to a related question that we got on YouTube from someone without an actual name. It was just user 4PL8TL9Z. So
That's Brian's burner.
yeah, user numbers, bunch of letters.
That's my cousin.
Said, does Boston Providence have an outdated philosophy on player development? The optics will look bad to the public who see guys get sent down if they make a mistake, as if punishment, yet the coaching to correct said mistake never seems to be looked at. They can't score and need more athleticism, since for a big team, they're not really as physical as they should be. Takes a shot at Carlo, compares him to Bambi. They seem to have either struggles with finding talent to fit their scheme or can't develop it if they have it. Hopefully, with the coaching change, they'll be open to different points of view. So, I guess to answer like the top part first, do the Bruins have an outdated philosophy on player development, or do you have a problem with their player development philosophy?
I think it's certainly a traditional outlook on player development. I don't know if it's outdated.
Yeah, all I know right now is that people are thinking there's no way that's not my burner account when there's a shot at Carlo calling him Bambi. So there goes my cover's blown. I promise it wasn't me. No, I don't know if it's outdated. I just think that look, they don't have a ton of great prospects. Like I think, only so many players really break through from the minors to the NHL, and oftentimes it's those that have that higher end skill that are meant to be NHL players. And then maybe you have some fourth line grinders that make their way to the NHL for a role like that. I think what you're seeing right now is there just aren't a ton of promising NHL caliber players in Boston. I'm sorry, in Providence, and there hasn't been for a while because the Bruins. It's like we've talked about in the past. It's one of the casualties of trying to remain competitive. You're seldom going to be drafting high in the first round if you're constantly finishing a top 10 team in the league. Now, back in 2010, the Bruins were a competitive team. In 2008, 2009, the Bruins were runners up for the President's Trophy and got upset in the second round to Carolina. They should have been a cup finalist that year. And then the following year, they go to the second round of the playoffs. They lose to the Flyers. That ensuing summer, they draft Tyler Seguin second overall because they actually sold high on Phil Kessel, who went on to have a great career. But unless there's hockey trades like that to bring back a high draft pick, you're not going to get high draft picks if you're constantly finishing top 10. And when that's the case for a decade plus, your pipeline is going to be very minimal and it's going to seem stagnant. Player gets called up, player gets sent down. It's because there's not a ton there. And it's because their prospect pool isn't the greatest. And I think that's what you're seeing more than a lack of philosophy.
This was my burner account's comment on the last YouTube video. Scott, you're wrong. Again, see below. This is my burner, in case you saw this comment on our last video.
Yeah, and I think I know what that was referring, because I saw that, and I think the below was I think on our last episode I'd said that the Montgomery getting fired to getting hired was the quickest in-season turnaround in NHL history, and I guess Bruce Boudreau actually had a quicker turnaround. So I think that's what I was wrong about. So I will own that. And Bridget, thanks so much for calling me out on YouTube.
I had to point it out.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so if on the Bruins development, I don't think it's outdated. I think it probably skews more conservative with young players, but that is also common among teams that are in it every year, that are either contenders every year or playoff teams every year. I think those are the teams that do tend to be more conservative, have shorter leashes, and just have higher demands for what their young players, what they need to see from their young players to stick. As I've said this a bunch before, even on this episode. Like, if you're a rebuilding team, if you're out of it, you can afford a much longer leash for young players. You can let them make mistakes. You can give them more minutes. You can try them in more situations, because you'll say that your goal is to win every game, but in reality, like, your goal is not to make a playoff run or even make the playoffs in some cases. If you're just dealing in reality. And again, like, maybe the Bruins end up at that point sometime this season if things really go south, but they're not there right now, and they haven't been there for a long time. Even like the last two times they missed the playoffs in 2015 and 16, they were in it right till the end, and they thought they were a playoff team. So even those seasons, they weren't. Now, once Cassie took over, like, yeah, you got, your Pasternak continued to develop, and McAvoy comes in, Carlo, DeBrusque. Like, you started to get like a little bit of a youth wave and a reset around that time. But the Bruins right now feel like they're kind of in like a little bit of an in between, where it's like they're trying to sort of cling to making a run with this core while Marchand is still here, and they hope, at least near like a high level of play, at least a top six forward still, while also recognizing that like they do need to get younger at some point. So they're trying to strike that balance. Like, they want more young guys contributing and getting involved, but they're not just gonna hand them those jobs and let them, play through whatever mistakes they make. Like, whether it's Patra, Lorite, Beecher last year, Lysells, who still hasn't gotten a shot. Like, the bar is going to be high for those guys, and there's going to be a certain level of consistency that needs to happen before those guys are, really given regular jobs.
All right, let's talk about one of those younger players as well, because Kim asked a question. She said that she saw the Blackhawks recently scratch Taylor Hall. Could you see the Bruins trying to trade for him, maybe send Patra to Chicago and the Bruins get Hall? Both teams would see a benefit. Patra would get to be on a rebuilding team that would play him and help with his development around vets such as Foligno and Patrick Maroon. And we would get Hall, who I think would give this roster the kick in the ass it desperately needs. Bridget and Scott, Matt Patra for Taylor Hall. Thoughts there?
Nope. You don't need to get.
I'm gonna go first, I guess, even though I had my hand up politely and said I was gonna go first. But the only person that benefits is Chicago. The only part of that deal but Matt Patra doesn't want to be on a rebuilding team. Matt Patra wants to win a Stanley Cup. I like Taylor Hall. You can get him for much less than sending your best prospect.
That's exactly it. Like, you don't have to give up Matt Patra to get Taylor Hall. He's on an expiring contract. He is drastically underperforming. Has not done much since he got to Chicago. Obviously, last year that was largely because of the injury he suffered early in the season. But yeah, he's had a not good start, and he makes $6 million. There would have to be salary retained. Like, no one should have to give up much to get Taylor Hall, and you're certainly not giving up Matt Patra for him. So I wouldn't worry about that. I guess, like, bigger picture, because I think we've only barely mentioned Taylor Hall, maybe a couple weeks ago.
I tried to.
Yeah, is like, I'm not totally opposed to it, but I just think if you're the Bruins, like, you need to be aiming higher than that. So you're going to bring in Taylor Hall, who's been underachieving in Chicago, and add him to your giant group of already underachieving forwards. I just don't know. Like, I just don't really think like that's the move to be making right now.
I think that the cap is the issue. It's the same reason why he's not in Boston. Like, that's the same reason that he got traded from Boston, was cap. At the end of a year where the Bruins were incredibly tight to the cap, and they couldn't afford to keep Hall, Foligno, Bertuzzi, Orlov. Like, they lost a bunch of guys because they weren't able to offer them some of those free agents. They weren't able to offer a big enough contract too that they could get elsewhere because other teams had space, and then some contracts were dumps. I think they liked Taylor Hall, but it was a salary dump. Nick Foligno, they like Nick Foligno. That was a salary dump. Like that was, here you go, Chicago, have two valuable pieces.
Well,
we just can't handle
Foligno was a free agent. So
Foligno was a free agent. Sorry, they both ended up there. But also, like the Bruins didn't have enough money to bring Foligno back. So point stands. Money was the main reason why those players ended up in Chicago. So money would be the main reason why it would be difficult to bring him back.
So guys, before the season started, I looked at Pavel Zacha's 59 points from a year ago. I looked at Charlie Coyle's 60 points, and I knew that those were inflated. Okay, I knew that those were inflated, and that those would be hard to probably meet again. But I was still hoping that they would still be between like 40 and 55, 40 and 50, because honestly, that's what Zacha's been in Boston. He's been a 55-point guy. And Coyle's been a 35 to 45-point guy in his career, depending on the year. And he's had a couple of years in the 50s too. So even if they took steps back from what their career highs were last year, I was still hopeful that they could be point producers. And then you add in Elias Lindholm. Maybe he's got 60 to 70 points, bounce back year with one of the best players in the world in David Pastrnak, at least offensively. And I said to myself, okay, they should be fine up the middle, not best in the league, but decent enough. And then they go out and add top 6 winger help at the deadline. That was my optimistic preseason approach. Now, having watched it play out, and you have Zacha and Coyle where they are with 7 and 6 points, whatever it is. I think Coyle has 5, and Lindholm has been struggling. Whether it's Taylor Hall, whether it's Chris Kreider, my fear with this Bruins team is that it doesn't matter if they go out and bring. I'm not saying not to do it, right? Because earlier we talked about Carlo and Frederick. I would do that deal. I'm just saying I'm not so sure how much a top 6 winger is going to help this team when they don't have any play driving centers at all. Like I knew that Zacha, Coyle, and obviously we anticipated Zacha on the wing to start the year, but I knew that Zacha, Coyle, and Lindholm wouldn't be like the best 1, 2, 3 punts in the league. Like obviously, but I thought they'd be good enough as a unit to be elevated by strong winger play. I'm not so sure if that's the case anymore. I don't know if I feel that way anymore. I'm not saying not to do it. I'm just not confident. Like you bring in Chris Kreider. Okay, who's his center? Lindholm, Zacha. I hope that would help, but I don't have the confidence. Patra, you get where I'm going here. Like, will the centers even allow Kreider to be Kreider if the team's just in the funk all year?
Well, yeah, and this comes down to like, are you making the deal that's there, or are you holding out for something better? Because, yeah, look, I agree. Like they're a team that still doesn't have a true number 1 center. Like, and by the way, like I hear people on sports radio be like, "Well, they're paying Elias Lindholm to be the number 1 center." No, they are not. Number 1's legit, top of the line. Number 1 centers are not making $7.75 million. They are making $10+ million. So that's not what you're paying Elias Lindholm to be. Now, you are paying him to be much better than he's been. Absolutely. But yeah, realistically, like he's a, mid to lower tier number 1, or hopefully a really good number 2, which is still another level or 2 up from what he's been so far. So yeah, like that's absolutely still fair. But I think you're still back in the same boat of like, okay, where are you finding that guy? Where are you finding a legit number 1 play driving center? Because those guys just do not become available by trade or free agency. And if you're going to draft one, you probably have to be in the top 10 to draft one. So they're really hard to find. And the Bruins haven't been able to find one. And I don't know that they're going to be able to this year.
Well, and that's kind of a bigger question too, because let me just quickly look at the league standings, and right now the Bruins are 19th. Okay, so like the Bruins, like Can the will the Bruins be bad enough to be a bottom 10 team and have a top 10 pick? I don't think so. But if they're between pick 1 and 15, or like if they're a mid first round pick, like what do you guys let's just be honest about what we've seen so far this year and where we think they could actually truly get to this year. Best case scenario. And if you guys in your heart of hearts think that this Bruins team at best, based off what you've seen, and it's not that the same group of guys couldn't come back next year and be better. Sometimes it's just a bad year for people, right? But let's say this year is just one of those years where Pasternak's a 70-point guy. I'm not saying he would be that next year. He'd probably go back to 110. But like, what's better for the Boston Bruins this year? If this is going to be what they're going to be, a middling 500 team, playoff bubble at best, you're probably not going to want to invest much at the deadline. You're not going to want to be a big buyer. What would be best for this Bruins team long term? Would it be to just float around mediocrity this year, maybe try to get a top 6 winger and maybe crack a playoff spot, maybe win a round? Or is it, you know what, let's just see where this team gets to by themselves. And if it happens to be a bottom 10 or bottom 15 pick, maybe that's not so bad to have in our arsenal as well. I know that's not a fun podcast to do all year. I know it's not a fun springtime, but have you guys asked that question to yourselves in your head driving around at some point this year, driving to the rink or the Garden, like what would be best for the Bruins this year? Would it be to just kind of like see how the year goes and just not trade away certain players or picks that you don't have to and just see where they fall and maybe just draft where you draft next year if it's meant to be?
Yeah, like stand pat versus
Kinda.
like,
yeah.
At first I thought you meant tank.
No, not even tank, but like they're not tanking right now and like they're a bottom 12 team. Like if this is what if this is what they are the first quarter of the season, maybe you just don't re-sign a couple of pending UFAs. And I'm not saying you tank, but maybe you just don't buy. You don't buy at the deadline, and maybe you sell high on some pending UFAs. And then just, again, it's November. Things can turn around. But, if we're thinking big picture, like, I don't know.
So I generally agree, which is why, like, I wouldn't be rushing to make a huge trade that involves giving up a first round pick or Patra or whatever. But I still am absolutely open to the kind of, player for player hockey trade shakeup, like, whether it's Carlo and Frederick for Kreider or, something along those lines. Like, that's not a trade that's mortgaging my future. I guess you can make the argument that trading away Carlo sacrifices something in the future. I don't know. Like, that doesn't do that to me. So like, I'm okay with that kind of shake up. If there's not a top pick or prospect involved, and I just don't think that really, like, I don't think a move like that really like hamstrings you long term or hurts your chances of retooling in the off season or whatever. So, but yeah, like, I absolutely have thought about that because it could very well be this team's reality. Like, they might not be a playoff team. We might be talking about, hey, are they going to trade off pending free agents as the trade deadline approaches? By the way, there's one of those who wears a C who a lot of teams would love to trade for if you're out of it. So that's a conversation for much later down the line. But like, yeah, the Bruins very well could be in a situation where they're thinking about that. I would just point out again, like, their one saving grace is that the Eastern Conference is not great this year. And unless you think the Buffalo Sabres are going to run away with that 8th and final playoff spot, chances are you're going to be in the race for a while here. So, I do think as long as you're in it, you try to win, because we've all seen teams get hot, goalies get hot. You have a goalie who just got hot this past spring. So, like, you should believe that that's something that's a possibility for you. So until they're really out of it, my eyes are still on how do we get into the playoffs, get ourselves there, and see what we can do.
Yeah, which is why a hockey trade is very appetizing for me. Like, if you can get Chris Kreider, a guy who, ordinarily, first of all, I wouldn't think would be available because the Rangers are supposed to be a contender. But a guy of his talent, you would think would have to be a trade deadline acquisition, which would probably be, picks or something like that. If you can get that in a hockey trade, you do it. You do it. You got, you know what I mean? All right, let's just finish up these two quick questions. Chip, we kind of hit on a lot of his questions, which is, the possibility of moving. I'll just quickly read it. Is a trade possible for the top six? Would Lohrei be on the block? I don't know. I don't see anybody else that any team would want. Geeky and Brazo aren't going to cut it. Outside of your discussion on paying goaltenders, which was extremely important to me, I've always thought of your goalies as relief pitchers. You know what? This one I'll actually
interesting.
Yeah, maybe that one will. Sorry, Chip, but in the essence of timing, we'll probably punt on that part of the question. Not that it was all related. So yeah, we've kind of talked about upgrading the top six via. I don't think any of us really want to do it. You're right. Like people don't really want a lot that the Bruins have, but we have talked about how the Rangers could want Carlo, or potentially somebody to shore up their defense. So there are hockey trades that are out there. Could there be a contender that just really wants like Charlie Coyle as like I don't know. You're not getting a top six in return for that. I think we've touched on the top six stuff, so we'll just move along to the last question. Sorry, Chip, to kind of butcher your question. The last one comes from Joe from Ohio, who said, just wanted to mention a coaching change. People are adamant that Don Sweeney has fired 3 coaches in his GM tenure. I totally disagree. Cam Neely fired Cassidy. Sweeney was fine keeping Butch. He basically said that a week before he had to fire him. Thanks and happy Thanksgiving. So, I mean, yeah, I think Cam definitely has had some say and maybe flex his muscle to Don a few times, but technically Don has fired 3 coaches, so that part is true. But as far as where it came from, I think that's probably debatable.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I can't let Don, a coach doesn't get fired with the GM not being on board with it. So, no, whoever's idea was initially, maybe we'll never know, but Don Sweeney fired Bruce Cassidy. That is what happened. So you can debate where it started, but that doesn't happen if Sweeney's not on board with it. So I would push back against that. Any general manager who has any pride, if your president of hockey ops forces you to fire a coach you want to keep, you resign and you go get another job. That cannot be taken out of the GM's hands, and I don't think it was.
No, I think it was a joint decision.
Yeah, and as far as the switch in tone, because I think what he's referencing is that at right after the season ended, it seemed like Sweeney was planning to keep Cassidy based on his comments. Look, yeah, maybe that's a conversation with Cam or even ownership that causes a change, or maybe it's just diving deeper into the season review. Maybe it's talking to players. Yeah. Maybe it's talking to your captains and realizing oh, yeah, we kind of knew Bruce might have been rubbing some guys the wrong way. And now that we've gone through the whole process, it was, it ran a little deeper than we thought. And maybe we have a little bit more of a problem here than we anticipated.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, there was every team does this. I'm pretty sure exit interviews at the end of a season from players, and where the GM pretty much says, "Hey, tell us exactly what you thought about this year. Don't hold back. Tell it." And if he got a bunch of negative reviews from players saying, "I don't think this coaching style is helping," then that probably affected it too. So seems like it was a combination of all sorts of different voices influencing the decision. At the end of the day, Sweeney is the one who him and Neely both have the final say on it, and there's no way he would sign off on it if he didn't agree with it, because you have to be able to stand by your decision and explain it and move forward from it and have your own direction that you're visioning, you're envisioning for the future. So you have to be able to stand by it.
You know what's interesting, guys? I have a random question for you, but people were making a story about how the Bruins have fired, 3 consecutive. Their last 3 coaches they fired were Jack Adams Award winners. Now, Claude Julien was here for about a decade. He won a Stanley Cup, went back to another one. He had missed 2 consecutive playoffs and was in a third season of potentially missing, because that was a down to the wire playoff clinching before they fired him. Cassidy was the winningest coach in the NHL during his tenure in Boston when Boston fired him. So I never liked that. And Jim Montgomery as well was obviously one of the winningest coaches in his tenure in Boston when they fired him. That tells you that the Bruins as an organization have very little patience for when things start to go a little bit south of the coach in one way, shape, or form. And because they don't want to risk missing the playoffs. Boston is very, very adamant on being a competitive team making the playoffs, as every team should be. However, my question to you guys is, do you think that the Bruins would ever, I'm not saying this is where the Bruins are, if the Bruins product on the ice was so obvious that they needed to rebuild and their voids in personnel were so obvious that they needed to rebuild, do you even think the Bruins would even like embrace that at all for a year or two? Because personally, I don't. And I think there's some fans out there that like that's kind of what bothers them about the Bruins, is like their inability to check their egos at the door if need be and take one on the chin if it's what's best for the team long term. It's just it's something that popped into my mind when you see how quick their trigger is on these great coaches. It makes you like, it really makes you think like they just would never, this regime would never embrace a rebuild. And I get it. You can't predict when it would be rebuilt. Sometimes it takes a decade plus, like the Sabres, and they're still trying. So it's risky, but yeah.
Well, if you look at what's happened this year, like the one of the main reasons that ownership doesn't want to rebuild is because you lose the fan base and people stop coming to games, and it's really hard to get that back too. Like sometimes people check out and then they never check back in. When teams are in a low stretch, sometimes you lose people, especially when hockey, not to us, but is viewed as like the fourth team in the city. It's like it's the Patriots, it's the Celtics, it's the Red Sox, and then people always say hockey's fourth. Like you're already fighting to get, and you haven't been because the team's been good. Like there's been sellout after sellout. Well, we just saw that sellout streak break.
That was corrected.
That was corrected.
Technically still going.
It's still going. Okay, because I wouldn't have been surprised if it broke then. Like it seems like it's there. Like if this team continues to lose, I think you're going to see that translate to people not spending their money there, because going to games is expensive. Ticketmaster sucks. Their fees, screw them with those fees. Like it's and getting to Boston isn't the easiest thing in the world. So you're going to start seeing the whole culture would change, because how do you get players to come here? You say, hey, we have great fans. Arena's always packed. Culture's great. We have a winning culture. People don't necessarily get drawn into, hey, come join us right now. We're in a rebuild. We don't know how long it's going to take.
Yeah, I think like that they might have an appetite for, like a short-term retool, like 1 or 2 years, like they did in, 15, 16, where, but it's like, it's going to happen organically. Like that wasn't planned. Peter Chiarelli got fired for getting them into that situation. And then Don Sweeney was given, the leeway to, okay, like we understand you're not going to be contender right away. So you can trade away Lucic, trade away Dougie Hamilton. Obviously, they didn't make the most of those draft picks that they got, but, like short-term retool and then hopefully get right back at it. I definitely do not think ownership would ever have the appetite for a full teardown style rebuild. They never would. Their expectation is to be a playoff team every year. And if they have to swallow, a year or two of that to reset things, whether it's for cap reasons or whatever it might be, like that they'll put up with. But probably with a different GM. Like if right now they're still in a window where they expect to contend and make the playoffs. And if it turns out that they're not that team anymore, then that's probably the end for Don Sweeney, just like it was the end for Chiarelli before him.
Well, and that's why I guess my question is really pointed at ownership. Not the obviously the GM and the president aren't. The GM in particular is not going to want to tank or rebuild, because that means it's his job. But like Bridget, to your point about like why would players want to come if like they wouldn't, and that's why like you wouldn't even want players to like be coming in, because you kind of want to suck for a little bit. And what I would say is, eventually, if you struggle and you get those high picks, well, people are going to want to go to Chicago to play with Connor Bedard. They're going to want to go to, like the idea would be you embrace the suck for, a little bit, then you get those players. Again, I know it's risky, because for every Chicago Blackhawks with Taves and Kane, there's, a Buffalo Sabres or an Ottawa Senators. Like, I get it. But look at the Bruins, right? Like in 03-04, they're one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. They lose in the first round to Montreal. You get the 05 lockout, 04-05 lockout. They come back and they trade away Joe Thornton. Heavily scrutinized deal. Went on to win the MVP of the league that year. Now, you did have a young Patrice Bergeron that maybe the Bruins were high on at the time and said, maybe this kid could be something for us down the line, but it wasn't a guarantee. 05-06 and 06-07, there were a lot of yellow seats in that Garden. I would say at least half the building was empty every single night. They trade away Joe Thornton. You're sitting there thinking, this team's never going to bounce back. The fans are never going to come back. You're in an empty arena for 2 years. And then 5 years later, you're hoisting the Stanley Cup. You get some high draft picks. Those get moved around. You start to you make some free agent signings that matter. A lot had to go right. Everything had to go right for the Bruins to turn that around. My point is, if you were to ask Bruins fans and management and ownership, or ownership in particular, when they traded Joe Thornton in 2005, 2006, whenever it was specifically, that 5 years later, Zdeno Chara would be hoisting the Stanley Cup in Game 7 of the Cup Finals. But it would take a couple of years of half-empty arenas and some uncertainties. It's just something that it's more directed at ownership. Yes, they need to answer themselves. Do we want to fire Don Sweeney and potentially Cam Neely if and when they deem that moment has come? Because it's worked for them in the past, this ownership group.
Well, that example is it's almost it's almost a better argument for not bottoming out. Like that 10-11 Stanley Cup team, it's not like that was built around a bunch of top 10 picks. Most of the young players were second or third round picks. And then Savard and Chara, I know Savard didn't play much in that 11 season, but those are free agent signings. Those are big splash, go out, spend money. Other guys like Ferentz were trades. The big picks they did have actually didn't make it to that team. Zach Hamill was a bust. Phil Kessel had already been traded away. So if any, that almost kind of makes the case for this ownership probably looks at that and thinks no, do it quicker. We're not going to draft a bunch of guys in the top 10 and wait it out and give them 5-6 years and hope that they develop into our Stanley Cup core. No, we would rather, we'd rather trade away a Phil Kessel to get something else. We'd rather go in free agency and sign a Chara and Savard. But yeah, as you said, yes, there are teams that do it that way, but for everyone that does, there's all the examples we've already gone. Just in your own division, look at how long Buffalo, Ottawa, Montreal, Detroit have been rebuilding, and so far have basically nothing to show for it.
So is the question more so what leads to success more, rebuilding, or an impact hockey trade that impacts the culture? So maybe it wasn't the tanking, because the Bruins didn't tank. I mean, they finished 13th, 12th and 13th in 06, 07 and 05, 06. They were still a bottom 5 team in the East, but they were top 10 picks, not top picks. But what you did do was Joe Thornton leaves, in comes Chara. The culture changed. Not from a direct hockey trade, but the culture changed. You look at the Florida Panthers. Jonathan Huberdeau scores 120 points. They ship him in one of their top defensemen out, bringing Matthew Tkachuk. Next thing you know, they got a Stanley Cup. Like, is it maybe there's a question in time about a potential impact culture change that Boston would have to go through if it seems that that's necessary. So yeah, it's fascinating. And another thing that pops into my mind, Scott, because you bring up those third, fourth round picks, Bergeron, Krejci, Marchand, Lucic, like all those guys, I think were third round and later. And like you got to tip your
first round was second. I know.
Was he a second rounder?
Yeah, pretty sure.
We'll double check that. But Krejci, Marchand, Lucic, like those guys are all later round picks. And you know you got to tip your cap to the Bruins scouting and development departments back then, because you're right. They built a championship team off of non-first rounders. The Tampa Bay Lightning in the last 10 years, Kucherov, Palat, Killorn, Point, like those guys were all non-first rounders. Yes, you had Stamkos, Hedman, Vasilevsky, but the ability to draft, everybody talks about you need to have those top end picks. And yeah, they help. They help for sure. But to have the ability to draft and hit on your draft picks outside the first round, Boston did it in the 2000s. Tampa Bay did it in the 2010s. And, you know, Patra, I guess, is a late example of that. But I don't know. It's a crapshoot. We're kind of going all over the place here. There's many ways to build a championship team. But I just think that ultimately ownership has to be willing to make some hard decisions if it deems necessary. And I don't know if the Bruins have that willingness right now.
I don't. I think that we're more likely to see nothing happen than something crazy happen. So
yeah,
but Bergeron, Krejci, Lucic were second rounders.
Really, Lucic was second round? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think ownership has the appetite for a teardown, and quite frankly, neither do I. Like, I'm one of the count me among the group that wants to try to win as much as possible and keep a window open and go for it as long as you have a chance. And if you end up in a position where you don't have a chance and you have to retool, then you do it. But I will never be pro tank or pro teardown. I just think you're just opening the door for a decade of irrelevance. Like that becomes an option, and I have zero interest.
And promises were made to players when they signed their contracts that wasn't going to happen. Like Pastrnak signing, Swayman signing, like these long contracts. Promises are made that we're never going to be a tanking team. Like this is going to be a team where you, for the next 8 years of your contract, this big long contract you just signed, we're going to be competitive. We're going to put a competitive product out there.
Yeah, and I mean tanking would mean trading those guys.
Yeah,
like those guys are gone in a tank.
They are going to have to find a first. And just to clarify, I'm not calling for it either. I'm in the same boat as you, Scott. Sometimes it's just fun to change things up in the podcast because we've had so many where it's just like they can't score. Want to have some fun conversation. But you know they are going to have to somehow, some way find a true first line center. Maybe it's Dean Letourneau. Maybe it's their 2025 first round pick if they don't trade it. You know, but they're going to have to find that.
I don't think it's Dean Letourneau.
No, it might not be, but yeah, they're hoping he turns into something. I'm just saying,
something for sure.
They're gonna have. You cannot go through. You know, you got to have a first line center, a true first line center. That's gonna have to be something that if they're not gonna be willing to retool, they're gonna have to rebuild. They're gonna have to get creative, and they're gonna have to find that guy because they don't have it right now. That much is a certainty. So, in any event, Bridget and Scott, any final thoughts? No. There's some Thanksgiving chatter Bridget may have wanted to get to, but at this point, 5 hours later, it's probably good.
Yeah, we're good. I'm going to have Thanksgiving with my family. Brian, you said you're not doing anything. Scott, I don't even know.
Family. Extended family. We go over my aunt's.
I'm not traveling. We're staying in town. I'm happy about that. Traffic was terrible yesterday trying to get to TD Garden. It'll probably be terrible again Friday when we try to go there for the Penguins. So,
Bruins game tonight too.
Yeah, last year Thanksgiving weekend I did the Bruins BU doubleheader down at Madison Square Garden. That was like the Saturday right after Thanksgiving, and I didn't plan well enough ahead of time, so I ended up driving because the train was like already sold out by that point. or tickets were like $500 or something insane. So I had to drive back from New York the Sunday at the end of Thanksgiving weekend, and that was just like the absolute worst experience you could ever have.
How long did you say you were in traffic?
It took me 7 hours to drive back from New York.
Normally it would be like 4.
Yeah, I got down there in under 4 because I drove down like early Saturday morning. I hit no traffic. That was awesome. But paid for it on the drive back.
Well, you probably will never do that again, but you do love BU hockey a lot. So.
No, yeah, I was gonna say I probably will because I'm an idiot.
Yeah, that too.
Well, Wednesday night you have the Bruins versus the Islanders, which is sure to be a highly entertaining offensive contest. And then on Friday, Bridget mentioned you have the Bruins Penguins. So Bruins, they got a lot of games here. We've talked about it before.
Sunday,
a big stretch.
Right, Sunday is the last centennial celebration.
Yeah, but their centennial game celebrating 100 years since their very first NHL game.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about it before. They have a very favorable schedule. Nothing's favorable when you're the last place offensive team in the league. But that said, they are improving their 5-on-5 play and chances. So they have a favorable schedule the next week. Plus, they got to take advantage of it. So it starts tonight against the Islanders again. Thank you all very much for listening. Have a wonderful and happy Thanksgiving with your friends and family. And we will talk to you very soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.